the economy is a game. One we're told we can win. One where all you need is the free market and the discipline to hustle your way through it. But this elaborate game of money and power, risks and rewards, which we call the economy, is different from the games you used to play as a kid. Different from the games you see in sports stadiums or on TV. Because in this game, the winning team gets to pick the referee and rewrite the rules to their benefit. That is what this video is about. For the last 100 years, a small group of incredibly wealthy and powerful players have been funding ideas. Ideas that led to rewriting of rules to guarantee they win, and you don't. They poured unbelievable amounts of money into selling you a story. One that makes it seem fair that they build empires and buy elections while you're exhausted from the grind of running in the hamster wheel of unpaid overtime, rising rent, and barely scraping by until you get your next paycheck. And the reason why you aren't winning in this game is because you're just not trying hard enough. Well, today I'm telling a different story. It's the story of how a handful of wealthy industrialists funded a full-scale propaganda machine to convince you that their wealth is earned and that it's fair they exploit us, profiting off our labour while destroying our planet, as they sail away on super yachts. So, welcome to the second part of my video series about the rise of neoliberalism. In the first part, I covered the psychological effects of neoliberalism. It's linked down below, so you can go watch it after this video. While they are part of the same series, they cover different aspects and don't really build on one another, so you'll have no issues understanding this one if you haven't seen the first one yet. But without further ado, let's get into this. Okay, so how did all of this even start? Let's rewind to the early 20th century, the golden age of industrial capitalism. If we talk about today's capitalism, there's obviously a lot of things to dislike. But trust me, today's capitalism is a sunshine and rainbow-filled paradise compared to the industrial capitalism of the 19th and early 20th century. Industrial capitalism was different. Like child labour, limbs in the machinery kind of different. Especially in the US. No safety nets, no worker protections, and definitely no minimum age to start working. If a worker was hurt on the job, it was their own fault for not taking better care. Protective gear and other safety measures weren't really a thing. So injuries, they're a very regular occurrence. The accident crisis, as it came to be known, was one of the earliest problems to be recognised as a social cost, or negative externality of capitalism. We'll be talking a lot more about negative externalities. I'll explain it a little bit later, but make sure to remember the word. Anyways, my point is that workers who got injured while working in a steel mill or coal mine or any other hazardous job, yeah, most of them were pretty dangerous. Well, if they got hurt, they didn't really receive any kind of support. So when they were injured and because of that were not able to feed their family, well, the whole family kind of just starved. But it wasn't just grown men losing fingers in machines. Children were right beside them. working in mines, factories, agriculture, or other demanding and dangerous settings. There were no rules. Basically, if you were tall enough to reach a machine lever, congratulations, you were old enough to work a 12-hour shift. This is how Conway and Oreskes describe the situation in their book. Also, a lot of my video is based on this book, and it's linked down in the sources document where everything else I'm talking about here is linked. Various reports and commissions had documented staggering rates of death and injury among children working in mills and factories. In Massachusetts, many children employed in textile mills were injured, crippled, or dead within just a few years of starting work. Now, thankfully, some mentally sane people saw this as a problem, and a growing wave of reformers started organising to put an end to it. Social activists, union organisers, and concerned academics began pushing for new laws to ban child labour entirely and introduce some form of basic protection for workers who got injured on the job. The logic was pretty uncontroversial. Kids should be in school and not be losing fingers in textile machines. And if your job leaves you permanently injured, maybe your boss should make sure your wife and kids don't starve. These reformers weren't pulling their ideas out of thin air either. By the early 1900s, European countries had already started introducing workmen's compensation programs and restricting child labour. So, like 100 years earlier than the US. And the system was working quite well. Families didn't starve anymore because the main breadwinner died in a machine accident. Children didn't work in mines, and the factories were, surprise, still profitable. Reformers in the US pointed to these models and asked, if European countries can do this, why can't the so-called land of the free? So they grouped together to push for laws that would serve as a safety net for workers and their kids. But not everyone was thrilled about this. Some of the most powerful industrialists, mainly the owners of the big factories, were deeply opposed to abolishing child labour or compensating injured workers, because both ideas had one thing in common: they would cost money. Child labour was really cheap, and regulation against it, as well as investing into worker safety, would impose costs on manufacturers. In order to fight these ideas, these powerful industrialists grouped together an organisation that until today is extremely powerful: the National Association of Manufacturers, or NAM. It was founded in 1895, and initially it lobbied for government intervention in the marketplace, advocating for protective tariffs and the construction of the Panama Canal. That way they could trade more profitably. However, they quickly altered their course and became primarily known for their opposition to unionization and federal taxation. It also reversed its position on the role of government in American business and industry. And especially now that regulations against child labour and for protecting workers was looming, they quickly became one of the loudest and most aggressive voices against the involvement of government in the marketplace. NAM is still a really powerful lobbying group today, with extremely close ties to the military-industrial complex and lobbying aggressively on issues like climate change regulation, which, surprise, they're not in favour of, tax cuts for corporations, union restrictions, and deregulation across the board. It is said that the passage of the 2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would not have happened without leadership from the National Association of Manufacturers. This 2018 tax cut was the predecessor to the Big Beautiful Bill. Both bills are hugely beneficial for big corporations and wealthy elites by lowering their taxes while cutting welfare costs like healthcare for the people that need it the most. The system increasingly rewards owning assets over working for a salary. It's a classic example of neoliberal policy design, rewarding capital under the assumption that growth at the top will eventually trickle down to the rest of the population. Trickle-down effects have been shown to not actually work in the real-world economy. I made a reel explaining the details on my Instagram. Follow me on there if you want to learn more about concepts like these in 2-minute videos. But for now, back to the beginnings of NAM and their fight against child labour regulation. Because, according to NAM, regulation on child labour and worker safety was a slippery slope to socialism. They framed child labour laws as an attack on freedom and individual responsibility. By the late 1930s, thankfully, NAM lost on the front of child labour regulation, and also a minimum wage was established, as well as the right to overtime pay. The absurd continuation of this story, though, is that after child labour regulation passed, NAM suddenly adopted a drastically different public stance. NAM issued a press release claiming that for many years the association had advocated the elimination of child labour. But let's have a look at NAM's other propaganda activities, which were essentially all in the name of keeping the government and taxes as small as possible and the profits of NAM's members as high as possible. And even though they didn't succeed on the banning child labour front, they were quite successful in getting rid of regulation in other parts of the economy. The financial sector likewise benefited from a wave of deregulatory policies shaped by Republican administrations throughout the 1920s. Deregulation and a laissez-faire attitude towards financial oversight created the perfect storm. Rampant speculation, unregulated banking practices, excessive leverage, and massive inequality in wealth distribution went entirely unchecked, until the entire financial system collapsed in what will be known as the Great Crash. The Great Crash triggered the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in modern history. When the Great Depression hit, it hit hard. Banks failed, unemployment skyrocketed, and people lost everything: their jobs, their homes, their life savings, and their ability to feed their families. But Herbert Hoover, the president at the time, had the idea that the free market would magically sort itself out. Well, it didn't. Instead of intervening in the economy, Hoover cut government spending and resorted to austerity measures. So yeah, all of that kind of didn't work out, so the misery of the Great Depression dragged on for 10 years. By the time the 1932 election rolled around, Americans were so fed up with Hoover's do nothing and let the free market handle it strategy that they elected Franklin D. Roosevelt in a landslide victory. FDR's conclusion was that waiting for the free market to fix everything just left people broke and hungry. So when he became president, his big thing was the New Deal. The New Deal was a sweeping series of reforms aimed at stabilising the economy and giving people actual support. Things like social security, unemployment insurance, job programs, and stronger labour protections. And it worked. The economy stabilised. The deregulation of the banking sector is what had led to the crash. And regulating markets had helped stabilise the system. It was proof that state intervention could solve problems that the market clearly couldn't solve. Oreskes and Conway write, Americans in the early 20th century were largely suspicious of big business and saw the government as their ally. Most Americans accepted a vigorous role for the federal government because history had demonstrated the need. Within living memory, the federal government not the private sector, had pulled the country out of the economic morass of the Great Depression. FDR had been beloved, elected and re-elected 4 times. But NAM and other business elites saw the New Deal as a direct attack on their power, because it was. And that was the reason for them to try and reshape the narrative. Launching one of the most aggressive propaganda campaigns the country had ever seen, to convince Americans that government intervention was bad for everyone and that corporate power wasn't so bad. One of the key figures steering NAM during this time was J. Howard Pugh, president of Sun Oil and an early architect of the organization's hardline stance against regulation. Pugh was all in on the idea that the New Deal was basically a Trojan horse for socialism. With Pugh and some other businessmen, NAM stopped just lobbying. They went full propaganda machine to fight the New Deal. Propaganda so powerful, we're still seeing its effects today. Here's how it played out. In the 1930s, NAM started distributing ghost-written newspaper editorials to small-town newspapers across the US. These news outlets received business news, statistics, graphics, opinion pieces, and cartoons straight from NAM's PR department. Often, these materials were offered in easy-to-use, camera-ready format, but with no identification of their source. So, while the editor would know the materials came from NAM, the reader would not. In 1938, NAM boasted that 5,500 newspapers around the country depended on this service. A 1939 congressional investigation put the number higher, 6,252 weekly and small daily papers. Let's take a closer look at these comics, specifically the cartoon figure invented by NAM called Uncle Abner. These comics were regularly presented as innocent entertainment in over 300 newspapers in the 1930s. Luckily, Alan Holtz, a comic strip historian, preserved some of these heartwarming gems on his blog.
Looks as if the politicians are trying to make corpses out of corporations. And Phipps thinks the proletariat is what you lasso steers with.
But the propaganda efforts didn't stop just there. And quite frankly, it's just not possible to talk about all of them in this video. But to illustrate the magnitude of all of this, let's take a look at the numbers. In the 1930s, NAM had an annual propaganda budget of just under $1 million. They increased that to $4 million by 1945. But the amounts we're talking about here aren't just $1 million in today's terms. Adjusted for inflation, $1 million in 1930 is equivalent to about $18.3 million today. And $4 million in 1945, that's roughly $70.9 million in today's money. And remember, we're talking about annual budgets here. These amounts of money were spent per year on convincing Americans that government is bad and inefficient, and the private sector is fast, efficient, and has Americans' best interest at heart. And NAM didn't just spend all that money on newspapers and editorial opinion pieces. They made film series, employee leaflets, used 45,000 billboards, estimated to be seen by 65 million Americans daily. NAM also started infiltrating Hollywood. By the late 1930s, they were producing actual films. Yes, corporate-sponsored movies, seen by 18 million people. These films portrayed heroic businessmen saving America, while sinister bureaucrats would try to ruin everything with their pesky rules and regulations. These films were all about promoting rugged individualism, competition, and everyone fighting for themselves. And as you saw in the first part of my video series, that is literally what we've all been convinced to do. Anyways, let's quickly go back to Hollywood, because NAM helped establish a mindset in Hollywood that would lead to the infamous Hollywood Blacklist, a list implemented in 1947, banning people who were perceived as communist sympathizers from working in the United States entertainment industry. And as we know, a lot was labelled as communist according to NAM, from regulation to taxes and social security. There is obviously a lot more detail and nuance regarding the Hollywood Blacklist, and it wasn't directly implemented by NAM, but by the House of Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. But there is a clear overlap in the broader network of businessmen, foundations, and intellectual movements that led to this chasing down of supposed communists. And I know this is not the main part of my video, but I just can't resist to tell you a little bit about HUAC. And I swear, bear with me, it is so juicy. The House of Un-American Activities Committee were a congressional body that held hearings to investigate alleged communist influence in the United States. In practice, that meant dragging people before Congress and demand they name names, and pressing them to testify against their peers. Refusing to cooperate would mean getting blacklisted, losing your job, and having your entire livelihood destroyed. Freedom of speech, not if you wanted to keep your screenwriting gig. HUAC witnesses included Ronald Reagan and Walt Disney. And I will get more into Ronald Reagan later, but let's stick to Walt Disney for now. Walt Disney was a hardline reactionary, well known for his anti-Semitic views. Disney testified to communist infiltration in the industry, blaming a 1941 strike at his studio on communist agitation and naming various industry figures, including one of his own animators, as communists. He was also a member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization established to protect Hollywood and the United States from communist and fascist infiltration. This culture obviously didn't just impact the industry, but actual films being made. While in 1947, 20% of films in Hollywood addressed societal problems. In 1953, just 5 years later, only 8% of films addressed societal problems. But back to Disney. It's worth remembering that when Disney pointed fingers at his own staff for supposedly being communists, it wasn't because they wanted to nationalize his studio. It was because they were fighting for better wages and conditions at his studio. And it all kind of snowballs from there. Disney really benefited from the lobbying efforts of NAM and its allied think tanks. We'll dive into more of them in just a moment, because their push for deregulation laid the groundwork for the kind of media empire that Disney went on to build. The Walt Disney Company has grown into one of only 9 major media conglomerates that control a significant portion of global media. As a result of telecommunications deregulation, the Walt Disney Company's holdings today include ESPN, Lifetime, History, A&E, FX cable satellite channels, the ABC Broadcast Network, 20th Century Fox, rebranded as 20th Century Studios, Marvel, Pixar, Lucasfilm, Hollywood Records, National Geographic, as well as Hulu and the Disney Plus streaming services. Such extensive media conglomerates would have been illegal before telecom deregulation. However, the consequences of deregulation also extend to labor conditions within the corporation. For example, 73% of workers at Disneyland, often referred to as the happiest place on earth, cannot afford to live nearby, and some even reside in their cars. Oreskes and Conway cite this as a direct outcome of deregulation. But enough about Hollywood and movies, and let's get even deeper in the ideology of NAM. Because NAM also came up with a core ideological construct, which they promoted far and wide. The so-called tripod of freedom. According to them, the founding fathers founded the United States of America on 3 indivisible principles: representative democracy, civil and religious liberty, and free enterprise. By 1944, this tripod of freedom had become the centerpiece of their propaganda activities. They insisted that compromising free enterprise by introducing regulation from child labour to environmental laws or corporate taxes would inevitably lead to the loss of the other freedoms. They called this theory the indivisibility thesis. The narrative they spun with this was that attempts to regulate the free market would lead to totalitarian communism. But there was another problem for NAM. They soon realised that their message about free enterprise, self-reliance, and rugged individualism, and the idea that chasing money and power was actually a virtue, kind of clashed with, well, the Bible. The dominant moral framework at the time, Christianity, wasn't exactly pro-billionaire. For example, in the New Testament, Jesus straight up says, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." The exact line shows up in Luke 18:25, Matthew 19:24, and Mark 10:25. So yeah, it wasn't exactly a footnote. But as we now know, there is a thing like the prosperity gospel, which is like a part of Christianity that basically says that if you pray hard enough, God will make you rich and whatnot. Basically, that just shows us NAM did pull it off. Also, this story is so juicy. How NAM pulled that off. Our guy Howard Pugh was all into lobbying the church, and he spent a lot of money on like a program called spiritual mobilization. Anyways, I kind of plan on making like a whole separate video of it because I want to go into all the details because it's like so scammy. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in that video. Anyway, let's move on and take a look at some other really sketch lobbying groups. Because while NAM was busy ghostwriting your local newspaper and making comics about how freedom dies with factory inspections, another industry group had its sights set on something a lot more influential: school books. The National Electric Lights Association. The National Electric Lights Association, NELA, was founded in 1885 and represented over 500 of the largest privately owned electrical utilities, accounting for more than 90% of US kilowatt output. In the United States, the electricity industry was primarily developed by private for-profit companies in the early 20th century. Urban electricity generation in the United States was mostly the work of entrepreneurs whose for-profit business made the required machinery, famously Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, and the private utilities that put that machinery to work, like Edison Electric. By the mid-1920s, private utilities had largely succeeded in electrifying urban areas in the US, but failed to serve rural customers due to profitability concerns. Dragging an electricity line through several dozen cornfields just to power one farmhouse, yeah, that's just not the stuff shareholders dream about. But rural customers wanted electricity just as bad as their urban counterparts, and many observers argued that they needed it more. But electrical utilities had neglected them. By the mid-1920s, most rural Americans still did not have access. In contrast, many European countries viewed electricity as a public good, something like water, leading to significant government involvement and the establishment of public and state-owned utilities. The contrast in results was stark. By the 1920s, nearly 70% of Northern European farmers had electricity, but fewer than 10% of US farmers did. In Pennsylvania, it was estimated that 90% of rural residents lacked access to an electricity grid. Moreover, country folks who were fortunate enough to have access paid much higher rates, often double their urban counterparts, leaving many farmers unable to afford electricity, even when it was offered. Yeah, I know. I'm talking a lot about electricity here right now and the history of electrical grids, but please, bear with me. I swear I have a point. And I mean, isn't it kind of also cool to, learn about the history of electricity grids? Also, it wasn't just European countries who had made electricity a public good. Another example of public utilities was right next door to the US. Canadians. The Canadian public electricity was also a lot cheaper than the one across the border in the US. So to address the market failure of the lack of electricity provision to rural areas in the US, some politicians tried to make proposals to change this so farmers could have electricity too, like Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot was a forest scientist, and when he was elected governor of Pennsylvania in 1922, he set out to bring efficiency and equity to electricity distribution. His plan, called Giant Power, aimed to provide electricity to all state residents, including rural areas, at a fair price. This was obviously a fact that the American electricity industry didn't like one bit. So the electrical companies all kind of came together, formed this NELA think tank, and starting in 1921, they launched a massive campaign that the US Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, later concluded was the greatest peacetime propaganda campaign ever conducted by private interests in this country. Above all, the industry aimed to discredit the very idea that the public sector could do anything more fairly or efficiently than the private sector. The goal was to strengthen the American people's conviction that the private sector knew best and to promote the idea that anything other than complete private control of industry was socialistic and un-American. Historian David New said this about it. The thousands of pages of testimony revealed a systematic covert attempt to shape opinion in favor of private utilities, in which half-truths and at times outright lies presented municipal utilities in a consistently bad light and private utilities in a good light. Their idea was to ensure straight economic thinking, meaning capitalistic free market principles, and to mold the minds of current and future generations. They aimed for a future where public officials would automatically oppose genuine regulation and voters would elect pro-industry politicians. Well, when we look at today's political landscape, we can definitely conclude they succeeded. NELA's strategy based on 3 pillars. First, recruiting experts and producing biased studies. They hired academics to produce studies that offered alternative facts about the costs of private and public electricity generation. Secondly, they rewrote textbooks. Pleased with the results of their Experts for Hire campaign, NELA executives moved on to their second phase, rewriting American textbooks and, in effect, American history. These satisfactory new textbooks were then distributed for free to schools and libraries. The last pillar of NELA's propaganda strategy was developing curricula and funding university programs. Nowadays, industry funding of academia is pretty routine and usually framed as philanthropy. And although ethical academics try to not engage in overtly ideological funding, it's definitely still an issue today. But back in the day, industry funding of academia wasn't a real thing. So NELA kind of came up with it. To hone its message, NELA enlisted Edward L. Bernays as a consultant, a man that is often considered the founder of modern public relations. Bernays' influential 1928 book, Propaganda, broadened the concept of persuasion to be used in advertising and propaganda. Edward Bernays stressed that for maximum efficiency, propaganda should be both continuous and, as much as possible, invisible. 2 of Bernays' most famous PR stunts were first in 1929. He helped tobacco companies convince women to start smoking in public by rebranding cigarettes as torches of freedom to appease to the feminist movement. But even more subversive was his work in the 1950s for the United Fruit Company, known as Chiquita nowadays. The US Banana Company basically had their empire in Guatemala. They were the largest landowner of Guatemala, owning the only port to the Atlantic. and their annual profits were twice as large as the revenue of the whole government of Guatemala. Also, in true imperialist style, they obviously had discriminatory policies against the indigenous population of Guatemala. The democratically elected Guatemalan government saw the company as a big obstacle to progress in the country, as workers and land were being exploited for the sake of the profits of United Fruits, which was a US-American corporation. When the Guatemalan government introduced laws that were, among things, allow workers to strike against bad working conditions, the banana company didn't like that one bit. So they hired Edward Bernays. Bernays helped spin a PR narrative that painted Guatemala's democratically elected government as a dangerous communist threat, lobbying newspapers and Congress with a concerted misinformation campaign. This led to a US-backed CIA coup in 1954 that overthrew the Guatemalan government and plunged the country into decades of violence under US imperialism, all in the name of protecting corporate banana profits. Anyways, this was the man that NELA worked with. Edward Bernays was also hired by NAM, as well as the American Liberty League, another group that I want to tell you about. The American Liberty League was publicly announced in August 1934. It was founded by businessmen, primarily executives from large corporations such as DuPont and General Motors. So obviously they owned a lot of stuff. For these propertied men, property rights were paramount, meaning they didn't want any regulation or state intervention telling them what to do or not to do with their property. So obviously they didn't like the New Deal one bit. And this became the central focus for the American Liberty League, opposing the New Deal policies of FDR. And obviously they labeled anything even remotely related to regulation as socialism. The American Liberty League leaders explicitly painted FDR as a potential dictator, fascist or communist, equating New Deal policies with totalitarianism. So you can see, these think tanks all kind of operate in the same way, funded by extremely wealthy industrialists that spend loads and loads of money on propaganda to convince the American public that government intervention is bad. But if there's one thing that stood out to them by that point, it was NELA's successes, and they realised that funding academia is kind of like the shit. So they doubled down on that strategy. While NAM, NELA and their buddies had already inserted their ideology into schools, newspapers and Sunday sermons, they still hadn't really made it into mainstream academia. I mean, yeah, they paid the occasional professor to publish some biased study or give a wonky lecture here and there, but the academic consensus at that time was all for government regulation in the marketplace. Back then, the dominant economic thinking was pretty skeptical of unregulated capitalism. The Great Depression had kind of shattered the illusion that markets could somehow self-correct if you gave them enough time. The contemporary economic thinking at that time was Keynesianism. Okay, so let's talk about Keynesianism. It is named after John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist and philosopher who advocated for state involvement in the marketplace. Not because he was some kind of revolutionary socialist, but because he believed it was necessary to combat the inherent problems of capitalism. He is today widely regarded as the father of macroeconomics. His most famous work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, was published in 1936. In it, he argues that markets are not rational and won't restore prosperity by themselves, but they require managing. Obviously, NELA and NAM business executives try to frame him as a radical communist too, but he was far from that. His main argument is basically that laissez-faire capitalism doesn't work. At its heart, Keynesianism and a good deal of mid-century economic thinking was to sort out the appropriate role of government in addressing business cycles, monopolies, and market failure. And the Great Depression was widely regarded as the biggest market failure. In the post-war era, Keynesian fiscal and monetary policies were widely deployed in advanced capitalist countries, like the UK and other European countries. The United States, under FDR, began adopting Keynesian strategies to address unemployment and stimulate demand. This period is described as embedded liberalism, and David Harvey explains it way better than I do. This form of political economic organization is now usually referred to as embedded liberalism, to signal how market processes and entrepreneurial and corporate activities were surrounded by a web of social and political constraints and a regulatory environment that sometimes restrained, but in other instances led the way in economic and industrial strategy. State-led planning and in some instances state ownership of key sectors, coal, steel, automobiles, were not uncommon. For example, in Britain, France and Italy. Embedded liberalism delivered high rates of economic growth in the advanced capitalist countries during the 1950s and 1960s. This was a time in which economic growth actually translated into better lives for regular people, with everyone profiting off the boom. Not just CEOs and shareholders, but workers, families, and communities. The post-war consensus, the idea that the state could step in to stabilise markets and serve the public good, began to unravel in the 1970s, when inflation and unemployment started rising while economic growth was stagnating. A nightmare combo known as stagflation. The global oil shocks and broader geopolitical instability further strained the Keynesian model. We'll get into how all of that shattered the Keynesian era in the next part of the series, where I'll also tell you all about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and everything starting from the 70s onwards. But long before the oil crisis, stagflation, or any of that occurred, the rich industrialists behind NAM, NELA, the American Liberty League, and other think tanks of the sorts had already been laying the groundwork for a different vision of economic theory. One where corporate interests didn't have to answer to pesky government regulations. So they went ahead, dug up a couple of academics who agreed, and financed a counter-narrative. A theory that was a lot more suited to the growth of their companies. Their first recruits were Ludwig von Mises and his prodigy Friedrich Hayek. Ludwig von Mises was a leader of the Austrian School of Economics, which adamantly opposed government involvement in the marketplace. Mises refused to acknowledge any middle ground. He saw only two options: tyrannical totalitarianism or pure, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. In 1940, Ludwig von Mises, who was Jewish, fled to the US to escape the Nazi advance in Europe. But once he got there, he ran into a problem. No one wanted to hire him. His extreme anti-government views were widely out of touch with the Keynesian consensus that dominated post-Great Depression America, and most universities had zero interest in giving him a platform. But being widely out of touch with the prevalent economic theory wasn't even his biggest shortcoming. Despite his insistence that economics is a science, he came from a tradition that collected little or no data. But lucky for him, he was saying the right stuff for business elites to want to step in. First, NAM hired Mises as a consultant, and later, Harold Luhnow, who was basically a nepo baby with conservative ideals, who had inherited the control of his uncle's charity fund, paid for Mises to teach at NYU. With the charity fund money, of course. But Mises wasn't the only thing Luhnow paid for with Volker Fund money. Remember the Volker Fund, as it will make regular reappearances wherever money is needed to fund free market fairy tales, or just generally brainwashing people that corporations have their best interests at heart, and governments and regulations are just a waste of time and money for everyone. Anyways, back to my point about Ludwig von Mises. Essentially, what I want to say with all of this is that Ludwig von Mises didn't get hired at NYU because NYU thought his ideas were so great. He got hired there because rich businessmen wanted his ideas out and made it happen. But Mises was by far not the only academic who Luhnow and his buddies would reach their cash-filled hand out to. Friedrich August von Hayek was Mises' protege, and similarly advocated for as little government intervention in markets as possible. He is most famous for his book The Road to Serfdom, in which he argues that centralized planning, even with good intentions, would inevitably lead to coercion and authoritarianism, so-called serfdom. So obviously, US business elites like Harold Luhnow of the Volker Fund were very interested in Hayek and his alarmist claims about government overreach. Luhnow sponsored Hayek's book tour and helped him land a position at the University of Chicago, which you'll see will become a very important place later. There's actually some nuance in Hayek's book as well, but Luhnow managed to transform the complex arguments in The Road to Serfdom into a simplified polemic, how government is bad and private companies are so much better and efficient and all of that. This was most notably achieved through a condensed version that was published in Reader's Digest and a cartoon version of the book distributed by General Motors. Later on, Ronald Reagan would come to read the Reader's Digest version of The Road to Serfdom. Well, and we all kind of know what he ended up saying.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
But it wasn't just Hayek's and Mises' theories that would end up fueling the ideological engine that is shaping economic policy since the Reagan era all the way until today. From tax codes that reward owning assets over labor, to deregulation, to the slow dismantling of welfare programs, all of that is still bearing the fingerprints of Luhnow, Pugh, and his business buddies like Jasper Crane and Leonard Read. Hayek and Mises were only a small part of the academic machinery built to justify these policies, because while they laid the ideological groundwork for these academic theories, the real institutional scaling of these came with the rise of the economists trained at the University of Chicago. See, the Volker Fund still had some spare cash to spend, and Harold Luhnow had realised that even though he liked The Road to Serfdom, it was too intellectual and too European to break through to the public. They needed it in a language simple enough for the common man to understand. In essence, while they valued Hayek's core argument about the link between economic and political freedom, Luhnow believed that the road to serfdom was not the most effective tool for their large-scale ideological campaign in the United States. So they concluded they needed an American version of the road to serfdom. The best way to get the book they wanted was to bankroll an initiative at a reputable American institution. They chose the University of Chicago, and the endeavour would be named the Free Market Project, which sometimes is also referred to as the Free Market Study. The only problem they had was that the economics department of the University of Chicago didn't want Hayek and the Free Market Project, mainly because their economics, well, they kind of sucked, and the people at the economics department of the University of Chicago thought that Hayek, Mises, and the other ones were insufficiently scholarly. So Luhnow had to pull some strings. With the economics department unwilling to host Hayek, the idea emerged to situate the Free Market Project in the Chicago Law School. And the key maneuver involved offering significant financial support directly tied to personnel so that the university would employ Hayek as well as other economists deemed appropriate by Luhnow and Crane, to make sure their money was actually doing the ideological work that they wanted it to. The Volker Fund didn't just bankroll the Free Market Project. They also set up an advisory board made up of persons sympathetic to the purposes of the project. The advisory board met regularly in Chicago, not just to check in, but to actively oversee the project, making sure the academics stayed on message and the businessmen stayed in control. As much as I want to go full true crime podcast on the Chicago School, for the sake of not turning this video into a several day-long deep dive, I'll just tell you about two of the other economists. But the history of the Chicago School of Economics is a complex one with many economists involved. I will tell you about Milton Friedman and George Stigler. But before I tell you about them, I want to thank today's sponsor, Brilliant. Because if this video shows anything, it's that education really matters. And one of my own goals this year has been to finally learn Python to get more comfortable with data analysis. Because if you want to understand economics or see through the corporate spin, you need to understand the numbers behind it. Also, this is actually not the first time that I've tried to learn Python. I started to try to learn Python like 4 years ago, but I always gave up pretty quickly. But this time I didn't give up because this course has made it super fun. I've also been working through the course on regression and classification, learning how to spot patterns in data and test relationships, which is exactly the kind of thing that helps me make better sense of economic arguments. And it's way more effective than passively watching a lecture because you're solving problems yourself and building real intuition. Beyond that, they've got thousands of lessons in math, science, logic, and AI, all designed to make you a sharper thinker. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/Annabocker, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Anyways, thanks to Brilliant for supporting the channel. And now, let's get back to Milton Friedman and George Stigler. Stigler is best known for developing the economic theory of regulation, also known as regulatory capture, a term which he coined. Regulatory capture is the idea that government agencies end up being controlled by the industries they're supposed to regulate. Now, that's not necessarily wrong, and as we can often see, that happens all the time. But Stigler's conclusion wasn't regulation should be better designed. It was more like, regulation is pointless, so let's just not. Which again is super convenient if you are the industry. See, George Stigler was hired at the Chicago School of Economics with funding from drugstore magnate Charles Walgreen Jr. Yes, the drugstore chain Walgreens. But Stigler didn't stop there. He also took it upon himself to give Adam Smith a little makeover. Now, if you're not familiar, Adam Smith is often called the father of capitalism. His most famous book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, laid the foundations for classical economics and introduced ideas like the division of labour and the famous invisible hand of the market. The problem with The Wealth of Nations is that it's extremely long. My copy is about 500 pages long. So in 1957, Stigler took it upon himself and published a shortened and simplified version of The Wealth of Nations. And I say simplified with very heavy air quotes because what he actually did was strip out all the parts that didn't align with his own free market views. And more important, the business magnate who was actually paying his salary. Okay, but what did Adam Smith actually write then about capitalism in The Wealth of Nations? Crucially, Smith was not advocating laissez-faire capitalism and recognized significant limits to relying solely on markets and self-interest. He understood that the market alone would not address all of society's needs. He argued that government intervention was necessary when self-interest fails. For example, Smith strongly advocated for the necessity of regulating banks, because the actions of a few individuals could endanger the security of the whole society. He also wrote about workers' rights in a chapter titled Of the Wages of Labour. He writes that wages can be understood as a contract between two parties, whose interests are by no means the same. The workmen desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter in order to lower the wages of labour. So far, so good. He goes on to write that masters have a lot more control over wages than workers. This control stems from several factors. First, their assets, which allow them to hold out longer in disputes. Second, the legal protections they have granted themselves through influence on government. Smith explicitly writes, "Whenever the legislature attempts to regulate the differences between masters and their workmen, its councillors are always the masters." Third, Smith observed that masters are always and everywhere in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination not to raise the wages of labour above their actual rate. Masters too sometimes enter into particular combinations to sink the wages of labour even below this rate. These are always conducted with the utmost silence and secrecy. He also insults everyone who doesn't believe him by writing, "Whoever imagine upon this account that masters rarely combine is as ignorant of the world as of the subject." The law, besides, authorises or at least does not prohibit their combinations while it prohibits those of the workmen. We have no acts of parliament against combining to lower the price of work, but many against combining to raise it. In contrast, when workers organise to fight back, their activities are always abundantly heard of and often met with demands for legal action. He also writes, "No society can surely be flourishing or happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides, that they who feed, clothe and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the produce of their own labour as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed and lodged." He goes on to conclude that if regulation, therefore, is in favour of the workmen, it is always just and equitable, but it is sometimes otherwise when in favour of the masters. Funnily enough, George Stigler completely omitted these passages. I wonder if there's any way that could have anything to do with Charles Walgreen paying his salary. But let's take a look at yet another passage that Georgie left out of his rendition of The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith devotes a substantial portion, around 120 pages, to tax policy, discussing different taxes in Europe and elsewhere, making it clear that while he was not enthusiastic about taxes, he saw them as both legitimate and necessary. Smith outlines 4 core principles of taxation. The first one being, the subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. I will say it again, in proportion to their respective abilities. In modern terms, progressive taxation. In other words, the rich pay more. Obviously, George Stigler left that out entirely. And yes, I know, the comment section under this video will probably be full of comments again, accusing me to be a socialist or communist or whatnot. But guys, I'm fucking quoting Adam Smith here, the daddy of capitalism. The reason why these arguments of Adam Smith have been forgotten? Well, a big part of it is George Stigler's shitty summary. Sections where Smith argued for regulating banks to prevent systemic risk, gone. Smith's views on regulating wages and protecting workers from exploitation, also gone. His support for progressive taxation to fund public goods, deleted. Economist and Nobel laureate Amartya Sen is cited as finding that a full reading of Smith reveals him as someone who was deeply concerned about the inequality and poverty that might survive in an otherwise successful market economy. Stigler's adaptation definitely does not show Adam Smith as a friend of the poor, but paints him as a much more cold-hearted market fundamentalist. Stigler stripped The Wealth of Nations of all its nuance and moral philosophy that makes Smith's work so meaningful. Now, you might think, Anna, nobody really cares about either of them anymore. What does this centuries-old academic discussion about economic theory have to do with anything, let alone with your rent increasing or wealth inequality on the rise, and all of the annoying outcomes of neoliberal policy we're seeing today? I mean, nowadays, no one reads Adam Smith or George Stigler. People are busy watching TikToks, so why does any of this even matter? Well, it does. Stigler's version has influenced curricula, especially in economics and business programs. These business students get a filtered Adam Smith. They don't read The Wealth of Nations. Over time, this has led to a more and more free market-centric version of Adam Smith. A version where all we seem to remember about Adam Smith is his invisible hand of the market sorting shit out. Anyways, let's move on to Milton Friedman, the most famous economist the Chicago School brought to light. One who would become more famous than any other economist in the 20th century. One who frequently appeared on TV, had a weekly news column, and who would regularly talk in catchy one-liners and become the most recognizable face of neoliberalism. First, let's take a look at who actually paid his salary. Surprise! The Volker Fund, managed by Luhnow and advised by his usual business friends, such as Howard Pugh, Leonard Red, and Jasper Crane. In short, again, Chicago didn't pay him out of their regular budget or research grants. Again, rich donors covered his salary because they wanted a catchy American sequel to Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and Milton Friedman would deliver it to them. His book, Capitalism and Freedom, was published in 1962, and it identified as the New Testament of American market fundamentalism, fulfilling Luhnow's dream of an accessible blueprint for free enterprise. It became highly influential, selling widely, and was translated into many languages. Let's go and take a look at what Friedman actually writes in Capitalism and Freedom. The book makes three key claims. The first one is competitive capitalism as a system of economic freedom is essential to the preservation of political freedom. The second one is government should be as small as possible. And the third is government can't be creative or innovative. Number one is essentially the indivisibility thesis that Nam had invented out of thin air several decades earlier. Remember how we were talking about negative externalities at the very beginning of this video? Well, Milton Friedman had a very, very special outlook on them. But first, let's go and take a look how negative externalities are defined. Let's look at how Investopedia, a far from communist or socialist outlet, describes negative externalities. What are externalities? An externality is a cost or benefit related to the production or consumption of a good or service that affects third parties unrelated to the production or consumption. It is generally the indirect consequence of everyday economic activities. So essentially, externalities are the side effects of some deals affecting people who are not part of the deal. Okay, the Investopedia article goes on to describe. Negative externalities usually come at a cost to the individuals, while positive externalities generally provide a benefit. For example, a crematorium releases toxic gases such as mercury and carbon dioxide into the air. This is a negative impact on people who may live in the area, causing them harm. Pollution is another commonly known negative externality. Interestingly enough, Milton Friedman had an entirely different name for negative externalities. Instead of calling a factory polluting the rivers and air of the people living nearby a negative externality or external cost like everyone else, he gave them the cute little name neighborhood effects. Making dumping toxic waste into the environment seem more like the annoyance of a leaf blower on a Sunday morning. But even more absurd than this very, very misleading euphemism for pollution is what Friedman says we should do about it. Friedman claimed that any government intervention to address neighborhood effects, for example, regulating what companies can and can't dump into rivers, would be a cure worse than the disease, because it would open the door to more centralized government power, and in his view, threaten individual liberty and freedom. In Friedman's view, your lung can take one for the team, as long as we're keeping bureaucracy at bay. Because God forbid we inconvenience a corporation in the name of clean air. Think that's weird? Oh, it gets a lot weirder. In Friedman's world, property rights were basically sacred. He believed that the freedom to do whatever you want on your property, yes, including pumping toxic fumes into the air or dumping chemical waste into a river, was so important, so foundational, that restricting it in any way would be a slippery slope straight to tyranny. In essence, the freedom of the polluter to do whatever they want on their property is way more important than the freedom of not being poisoned by pollution. But that's not all. Oreskes and Conway point out that when it came to history, Friedman also exhibited a reckless disregard for facts, making one astonishingly erroneous claim after the other. For example, his claim of capitalism and freedom being linked seems a little shaky when considering that capitalism did not bring freedom to the 4 million souls who lived under American slavery. They also go on to write that a few years after the publication of Capitalism and Freedom, the economist Paul Samuelson tried to test the indivisibility thesis. Samuelson generated a graph indicating no clear relation between economic and political freedom, to the extent that the analysis suggested in any relation it was a negative one. When or where economic freedom increased, political freedom decreased. Capitalism and Freedom is full of wild, unsubstantiated claims. Despite all of this, Capitalism and Freedom sold extremely well, never went out of print, and is to this day still widely influential. Milton Friedman's book was not the product of open competition in the marketplace of ideas, but rather had been financed, nurtured, and promoted by American businessmen. Capitalism and Freedom was the wet dream of Luhnow and his business buddies like Jasper Crane and Leonard Read. Friedman would become not only the most influential economist of his generation, but one of the most influential public intellectuals. In 1966, he became a regular columnist for Newsweek, and he would go on to write hundreds of opinion pieces for mass media. In the 1970s, he spoke frequently in London at the Institute of Economic Affairs, where he was credited with shaping Thatcher's policies, which in turn influenced Ronald Reagan. Friedman became an advisor to both leaders. He also advised Chilean economists affiliated with the dictator Augusto Pinochet after the CIA had yet again overthrown yet another democratically elected socialist government. By now, it should be clear that American business magnates do not like democratically elected communist or socialist regimes in their backyard Latin America. Anyway, in 1976, Friedman would be awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. In the 1980s, he had his own television program, Free to Choose, a 10-part series produced by PBS. His television series, Free to Choose, is still available on YouTube and Amazon Prime. Free to Choose wasn't exactly a budget production, racking up a $2.5 million in production costs, making it one of the priciest economics lectures ever filmed. Most of the money came from 15 corporate funders and conservative foundations. The former include PepsiCo, W.R. Grace, General Mills, General Motors, Firestone, Getty Oil, and the Whittaker Corporation, which is a major military contractor. And funnily enough, they chose not to be mentioned in the credits. Anyways, back to Friedman and his achievements. He earned both the National Medal of Science and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded to him by President Reagan. In short, he didn't just rise to success. He was launched into intellectual stardom with a full corporate PR budget behind him. His academic fame was definitely not earned by competing in some form of academic meritocracy, but by riding a well-funded ideological wave. It's evident that his ideas only became so big because rich businessmen used a lot of money to enable their creation to then fund and promote them. And the funny thing is, Friedman doesn't even oppose that. In his book he writes, "One feature of a free society is surely the freedom of individuals to advocate and propagandize openly for a radical change in the structure of society. But for advocacy of capitalism to mean anything, the proponents must be able to finance their cause, to hold public meetings, publish pamphlets, buy radio time, issue newspapers and magazines, and so on. How could they raise the funds? In a capitalist society, it is only necessary to convince a few wealthy people to get funds to launch any idea, however strange. The reality which Friedman acknowledges is if your idea doesn't please the rich, it probably won't go very far. Under capitalism, anyone with money can promote whatever ideas they like and shape society to their liking. And rather seeing that that could be a problem, that the wealthy basically get a megaphone, Friedman celebrates it. Also, this dynamic isn't hypothetical, it's been well documented. Harvard professor Yochai Benkler and his colleagues have demonstrated that disinformation and propaganda exhibit an asymmetry with a significantly greater volume of right-wing claims compared to left-wing ones on the internet. Controlling the narrative takes serious resources, time, money, and control over media platforms that shape public opinion. That's why billionaires have been buying up media outlets. Jeff Bezos snagged up the Washington Post. Patrick Soon-Shiong took over the Los Angeles Times. Elon Musk famously bought Twitter, and Mark Benioff scooped up Time magazine. Edward Bernays, the propaganda consultant I mentioned before, is cited as stating that those who manipulate the views of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Anyway, there's one last thing I want to tell you about. Because the brainwashing didn't just stop at academia, think tanks, lobbyism, and controlling the media narrative. Some companies have taken it even further, injecting free market ideology and especially anti-unionism straight into the workplace. General Electric was a leading member of NELA and continued to support it after it got shot down and then reconstituted as the Edison Electric Institute. Starting in the 1950s, General Electric ran a massive campaign to push the narrative that people who didn't subscribe to the free enterprise system were economically illiterate and needed to be re-educated. GE executives argue that the real threat to worker prosperity was not low wages but burdensome federal taxation, which drained money from productive investment and left less money for workers. How did they do that? GE's PR department worked to place articles and encourage editorials favourable to the company in local newspapers where GE operated. This was made easier by GE often being the biggest local employer and advertiser, kind of the old but gold strategy as we saw with NELA and NAM. But GE also went on to produce a variety of their own publications, such as GE Work News, which was a newsletter distributed to workers on Fridays, designed to be taken home and read by family members. It mixed local interest items like company bowling league standings and Miss GE beauty pageants with anti-union propaganda. Another one was The Monogram, a glossy monthly magazine filled with free enterprise propaganda. Oreskes and Conway Wright. GE also mailed publications directly to workers' homes, where they and their families could read articles with overtly anti-union headlines, such as "Show how employees not represented by unions get their wage and benefit improvements without the possible delay of waiting for union acceptance." Union rebuttals obviously did not appear. GE also sponsored employee book clubs to combat economic illiteracy. These clubs met weekly for 16 weeks and featured economic texts, often with an Austrian school slant. And their last but definitely not least propaganda tactic was the General Electric Theatre, a primetime TV show running from 1953 to 1962 that was one of the most successful TV shows ever produced. This wasn't just television, it was a full-blown ideological project. Week after week, the show served up neatly packaged narratives of hard work, personal responsibility, and the dangers of big government. And it was hosted by none other than Ronald Reagan, who at the time was an actor with a fading Hollywood career. Hosting this widely popular show dramatically revived his public profile, laid the foundation for his political career, and earned him the nickname the Great Communicator. Reagan walked away from that job with a nationally recognizable face, a polished political persona, and a huge network of corporate backing, as well as the ideological script that he would soon take to Washington. But that's the story for the next video. In the meantime, if you haven't seen it yet, check out the part 1 of this series, where I break down how this ideology of rugged individualism doesn't just shape the economy, but how it has reshaped our minds and souls, turning us into never-ending self-optimization projects. As you can see, this kind of video takes an insane amount of research, work, and I do it all by myself. So if you want to support my work so I can make more of these videos, you can become a Patreon subscriber, as that would help me invest more into the production of these videos. Anyways, see you soon. Bye.